June 1942 marked the most precarious tipping point of World War II as Winston Churchill and Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto engaged in a silent global chess match that spanned two oceans. While Admiral Yamamoto's formidable carrier strike force cast a long, suffocating shadow over the Pacific, the Prime Minister faced a harrowing decision that could effectively surrender the Suez Canal to the Axis powers. Could a naval engagement fought thousands of miles away in the mid-Pacific truly dictate the fall of Cairo and the loss of the Middle Eastern oil fields? The answer remained locked within a series of frantic, top-secret cables that shifted the very foundations of the war. The year 1942 was described by many in the British High Command as the year of disaster, a period where the prestige of the Royal Navy and the resilience of the British Army were tested to their absolute breaking points. Following the catastrophic fall of Singapore and the humiliating loss of the HMS Prince of Wales and HMS Repulse, the Indian Ocean had become a Japanese lake, leaving the rear flank of the Suez Canal terrifyingly exposed. Churchill knew that if the Imperial Japanese Navy moved in force toward the Gulf of Aden, the entire logistical spine of the British war effort in North Africa would be severed. As the month of June opened, the strategic atmosphere in London was one of suffocating tension and grim anticipation. Churchill was receiving intelligence reports that suggested the Japanese were preparing a final decisive blow against the American fleet at Midway. Yet his primary concern remained the integrity of the Mediterranean. General Claude Auchinleck was struggling to hold the line at Gazala against the relentless maneuvering of Erwin Rommel, but the Prime Minister's eyes were constantly drifting toward the east. He understood with a cold, mathematical certainty that the Mediterranean was a cage, and the key to that cage was held by the naval masters of the Pacific and Indian Oceans. The frantic cables began to fly between 10 Downing Street and the Admiralty as the news of Japanese carrier movements reached the Western Allies. Churchill questioned Admiral Dudley Pound with an intensity that bordered on desperation, demanding to know how many capital ships could be spared for the Eastern Fleet without inviting a total collapse in the Atlantic. The fear was not just of a German victory in the desert, but of a monstrous great pincer movement where German forces from the Caucasus and Japanese forces from the Indian Ocean would meet in the ruins of a conquered Middle East. On the morning of June 4th, the world held its breath as the first reports of the Battle of Midway began to filter through the static of long-range radio transmissions. In Washington, Admiral Chester Nimitz was orchestrating a gamble of historic proportions, but in London, the news was filtered through the lens of British survival. Churchill realized that if the United States Navy failed, the Royal Navy would be forced to abandon the Mediterranean entirely to prevent a Japanese invasion of India and the subsequent encirclement of the Suez Canal from the rear. The tactical nuance of this period is often overlooked in traditional histories that focus solely on the North African sands. We must look at the psychological weight pressing down on the Admiralty, where men like Admiral James Somerville were commanding an Eastern fleet that was essentially a collection of obsolete battleships and overworked crews. These men were the thin line of defense against a Japanese carrier force that had remained undefeated since Pearl Harbor, and their survival depended entirely on the outcome of a battle they could not see and could not influence. When the news finally arrived that the USS Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown had sent 4 of Japan's elite aircraft carriers to the bottom of the Pacific, the reaction in the British War Cabinet was not just one of celebration, but of profound strategic recalculation. The victory at Midway acted as a sudden, violent release of pressure, yet it created a new and immediate dilemma for Winston Churchill. With the Japanese carrier threat temporarily blunted, the Prime Minister saw a fleeting window of opportunity to pivot his dwindling resources back toward the defense of Egypt. But the Admiralty remained terrified of a Japanese resurgence. Churchill's cables during the specific 48-hour window reveal a man possessed by the need for aggression. He began to pressure the Admiralty to cancel the planned diversions to the Indian Ocean and instead double down on the reinforcement of the Mediterranean. This was a leadership dilemma of the highest order, as the Prime Minister had to weigh the verified destruction of Japanese naval power against the very real and present danger of Rommel's Panzer Army Africa, which was at that moment preparing to storm the fortress of Tobruk. The shifting naval equilibrium meant that the Royal Navy could now gamble with its remaining assets. Churchill argued that the Midway Dividend should be paid in the form of increased convoy protection for Operation Vigorous and Operation Harpoon, the desperate attempts to resupply the besieged island of Malta. He viewed the Suez Canal not as a static line on a map, but as a dynamic theater that was now safer from the east, allowing for a total, uncompromising focus on the threat from the west. However, the military bureaucracy in London was far more cautious than the Prime Minister. The Admiralty argued that while the Japanese had lost their primary strike force, their surface fleet remained the most powerful in the world, and any withdrawal of British ships from the Indian Ocean could still invite a catastrophe. This internal conflict between Churchill's aggressive intuition and the Admiralty's calcified defensive posture created a period of strategic paralysis that nearly cost the British the war in the desert. We see this tension reflected in the private diaries of senior British officers who felt that Churchill was moving too fast to exploit a victory that was not even his own. General Alan Brooke, the chief of the Imperial General Staff, frequently noted in his journals that the Prime Minister's fascination with the big picture often led him to ignore the grueling, tactical realities of logistics and ship maintenance. The ships that Churchill wanted to move were battered, barnacle-encrusted vessels that had not seen a dry dock in months. As the dust settled over the Pacific, the reality of the Suez rear flank became the central obsession of the British leadership. The Suez Canal was the jugular vein of the empire, and for the first time in the war, the threat of it being cut from the Indian Ocean side had diminished. Churchill began to draft a series of directives that would prioritize the Mediterranean dominance strategy, effectively deciding that the gamble at Midway had bought the British the right to risk everything in North Africa. This pivot was not without its critics. Australian and New Zealand leaders were horrified by the idea that Churchill might leave the Indian Ocean vulnerable to a Japanese surface raid. The political fallout of the Midway victory was as complex as the military one, forcing Churchill to engage in a masterful display of diplomatic theater to keep his Commonwealth allies from withdrawing their troops from the Middle East to defend their own shores. The technical precision required to execute this shift was staggering. It involved the rerouting of hundreds of merchant ships, the reassignment of air cover, and the reorganization of the entire intelligence apparatus in the Far East. Churchill was operating as both a politician and a supreme commander, using the Midway result as a lever to force the Admiralty into a more proactive stance against the Italian and German navies in the Mediterranean. In the shadows of this grand strategy, the common soldiers and sailors felt the change in the air. On the decks of HMS Warspite and the other ships of the Eastern Fleet, there was a sense that the imminent threat of a Japanese invasion had been replaced by a more familiar, though no less deadly grind of colonial defense. The Midway effect was filtering down from the high-ceiling rooms of London to the humid, oil-slicked engine rooms of the British fleet. Ultimately, part one of this saga reveals that Midway was not just an American victory, it was a British reprieve. It was the moment Winston Churchill stopped looking over his shoulder at the Japanese and began to stare directly into the eyes of the Desert Fox, Erwin Rommel. But as the Prime Minister prepared to launch his counteroffensive, a new question emerged. Had he overestimated the safety of the Indian Ocean? And would the Suez Canal pay the price for his audacity? With the Japanese carrier fleet shattered at Midway, Winston Churchill turned his full, formidable attention back to the Mediterranean. But the shadow of the Indian Ocean refused to dissipate entirely. The Prime Minister's strategy was now a high-stakes balancing act. He had to convince the Admiralty that the rear flank of the Suez Canal was secure enough to justify a total commitment to the destruction of the Axis forces in North Africa. This was a period of frantic intelligence gathering and brutal honesty within the halls of British power, where the cost of a single mistake would be the loss of the entire Middle East. The cables from mid-June 1942 show a Churchill who was emboldened by the American success, but deeply frustrated by British setbacks. Even as the threat from Japan receded, the situation in the Western Desert was deteriorating. The fall of Tobruk on June 21st sent shockwaves through the empire, a disaster that occurred just as Churchill was, in Washington, discussing global strategy with President Roosevelt. The irony was bitter. The naval threat had been neutralized in the Pacific, but the land threat in Africa had never been more potent. Churchill realized that the defense of Suez now depended on a massive influx of tanks and aircraft that had originally been earmarked for the defense of India and Australia. He had to use the Midway outcome as a political shield to justify stripping the Eastern Fleet of its most modern assets. In a series of sharp, uncompromising memos, he argued that the Japanese would be too busy licking their wounds in the Pacific to launch a major offensive toward the Red Sea. This was a calculated risk of the highest order, gambling the security of the Indian subcontinent against the survival of the Egyptian front. The Admiralty, led by the stoic Admiral Dudley Pound, remained deeply skeptical. They pointed out that while the Japanese had lost 4 carriers, their battleship force, including the monstrous Yamato, was still intact. The fear was that a Japanese surface fleet could still steam into the Indian Ocean and bombard the ports of Ceylon in East Africa, effectively cutting the Cape route, the primary supply line for the British Eighth Army. Churchill's response was a masterclass in strategic prioritization, famously stating that, "We cannot be strong everywhere at once." As the British began to move reinforcements through the Suez Canal from the east, the logistical complexity was a nightmare. The rear flank defense involved the installation of massive coastal batteries and the deployment of long-range reconnaissance aircraft to monitor the approaches to the Gulf of Aden. Every ship moved from the Indian Ocean to the Mediterranean was a victory for Churchill's Suez First policy, but it left the Royal Navy's presence in the East a mere ghost of its former self. We must also consider the perspective of the Japanese High Command. Admiral Yamamoto was indeed forced to reassess his plans for the Indian Ocean following the Midway disaster. The Operation G plan, which envisioned a major offensive toward the Persian Gulf to link up with the Germans, was effectively mothballed. Churchill's intuition was proving correct. The Pacific was the master theater, and its tides dictated the depth of the water in every other harbor in the world. Throughout July and August of 1942, the tension reached its zenith. While General Bernard Montgomery took command of the Eighth Army and began the meticulous buildup for the Battle of El Alamein, Churchill was still fighting a bureaucratic war in London. He was constantly defending his decision to leave the rear flank of the Suez lightly guarded. He relied heavily on ultra-intelligence, the decryption of German and Japanese codes, to confirm that no secret naval rendezvous was being planned between the Axis powers. The technical mastery of the British signal intelligence during this period cannot be overstated. By reading the Japanese naval codes, JN-25, the British knew that the Imperial Japanese Navy was shifting its focus to the Solomon Islands and Guadalcanal. This confirmed to Churchill that his Midway pivot was not just a lucky guess, but a sound strategic maneuver. The Suez Canal was safe from the east, not because of British strength, but because of Japanese exhaustion and American tenacity. The psychological impact on Churchill himself was profound. Those who saw him during the summer of 1942 described a man who was alternating between bouts of deep depression over Tobruk and bursts of manic energy following Midway. He understood that the war had changed from a struggle for survival into a struggle for the initiative. The victory at Midway had given him the one thing he needed most, the luxury of choice. For the first time since 1939, the British were no longer merely reacting to Axis moves. They were choosing where to fight. This period also saw a shift in the relationship between Churchill and his military commanders. The Prime Minister's insistence that the rear flank was secure led to a more aggressive stance from the Royal Air Force in Egypt. They were no longer holding back squadrons to defend against a hypothetical Japanese air raid from the sea. They were unleashed against Rommel's supply lines in the Mediterranean. This air superiority would prove to be the deciding factor in the upcoming battles. As the narrative marches toward the climax at El Alamein, we see the true legacy of the Midway outcome. The desperate Indian Ocean defense that had characterized the early months of 1942 had been transformed into a strategic holding action. Churchill had successfully reassessed the defense of the Suez Canal by recognizing that its greatest protection was the wreckage of Japanese carriers sitting at the bottom of the Pacific. The human cost of this strategic pivot was felt by the sailors of the Eastern Fleet, who remained in a state of constant grinding readiness for an enemy that would never arrive in force. They were the forgotten fleet, sacrificed in terms of prestige and equipment so that the Eighth Army could have the tools it needed to win in the desert. Their silence in the Indian Ocean was the necessary music for the thunder of the guns at Alamein. By the time the tide turned in North Africa in late 1942, Churchill's reassessment was vindicated. The Suez Canal remained open, the oil of the Middle East remained in Allied hands, and the Japanese were locked in a war of attrition in the South Pacific from which they would never recover. The frantic cables of June had become the foundation of the Allied victory in the West. In retrospect, the link between Midway and Suez is one of the most elegant examples of global strategy in the history of warfare. It demonstrates that World War II was not a series of isolated conflicts, but a single, massive, interconnected system of pressures and reliefs. Churchill, for all his flaws, was the one leader who could see the threads connecting a sinking carrier in the Pacific to a moving tank in the Sahara. The conclusion of this strategic saga leaves us with a profound image of Churchill in late 1942, finally able to breathe. The Suez Canal's rear flank was no longer a source of panic, but a secure gateway for the final liberation of Europe. The Pacific's shifting tides had indeed compelled him to prioritize, and in that prioritization, he had saved the heart of the British Empire. The story of how Midway saved Suez is a testament to the fact that in global war, the most important battle is often the one you don't have to fight. Because the Americans won at Midway, Churchill didn't have to lose at Suez. The equilibrium had been restored, and the road to victory, though long and bloody, was finally visible through the smoke of two oceans. If the United States had lost the Battle of Midway, do you believe Winston Churchill would have been forced to abandon the Suez Canal in North Africa entirely to defend India? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell.